I'm sure you know the experience of watching, whether it's a show, a movie, or engaged in a book or a story of some kind, and you get to the ending and it falls off a cliff. It doesn't end properly, and you don't get the answers that you want, and basically, it's what we call an unresolved ending. That happens with Jonah, and for some people, it's a deeply unsatisfying book at the end. Even just the language at the very end of the book, as Richard read for us, who cannot tell their right hand from their left, and also many animals. What a way to end a book. Why would, now some would theorize that we've lost part of it, that some of it's been chopped off and the scroll's missing. The people quite often think that about the Gospel of Mark, that ends really abruptly. But I think so far we've seen Jonah as such an amazing work of, it's a literary masterpiece in many ways. I'd rather try and see if there's some intentionality and something deliberate about this. Because the fact that it ends quickly and you're left with that, oh, I wonder what happened and what's going on. I think you're meant to feel that, and I think the writer wants you to feel that because I think through that they're making a point. Because doesn't that happen with lots of things in our lives? Not necessarily around endings, but aren't we very often left wondering about things and trying to fathom the mysteries of the universe and questions that, how many of us just have questions we do not get answers to? I think that's where the book of Jonah is trying to take us, all the while showing us there's something really tangible about the goodness of God, even in the midst of life being a bit like that. Even the way this chapter starts, then the word of the Lord, sorry, no, that was last week, but to Jonah this seemed wrong. What seemed wrong? Well, we saw last week that he'd finally gotten back on track with his calling to go and preach to the Assyrian city of Nineveh, and it was a city that was rampant with wickedness and violence, and we thought initially that perhaps he was scared of that. He would be in hostile and enemy territory. And we see this week that that wasn't exactly the whole story. He went and he preached to them, and miracle of miracles, revival broke out. It worked. They believed what he was saying in his 5-word sermon, and they decided to sincerely, with all their hearts, turn to the God of Israel and to reorder their society around that. And that's where we pick up the story this week. So I want to see what we can about God through this, even if we are not going to get tidy answers to the whole book and chapter, and perhaps even to life. I still think there's things that we can hang on to. I want to look at God as a merciful God, as a sheltering God, and ultimately a mysterious God. To this, Jonah seemed very wrong, and he became angry. Why? Because God has shown himself to be a merciful God. Isn't this what I said when I was still at home? That's why I tried to run away. I knew that you're a gracious and compassionate God, slow to anger and abounding in love, who relents from sending calamity. So rather than be afraid of this enemy people who were infamous for their violence and their cruelty, which is definitely how you're meant to start when you're reading the book of Jonah, going, he doesn't want to go because he's going to get a doing, and he doesn't want that to happen. That's not the case at all. He doesn't want to go because he can't stand them, and he knows that God is who he says he is, and he's faithful to what he's decreed he will do, that if anyone calls on the name of the Lord, that they will find shelter and mercy and be brought in. And he thought, I knew he was going to do that. And he didn't want that for them because he couldn't stand his enemies. And his complaint against God is that God has integrity and God follows through on doing what he will say. Can you imagine if that was someone's worst complaint about you? You always follow through and you always keep your word. That's what he's complaining to God about. And I think you are meant to try and see that Jonah is just being absurd. Rightly so, we see him as being absurd. Why would you not want anyone to find and experience the mercy of God? And this would have been such a challenge, because remember, Jonah, this book is written to the people of Judah when half of their people have been deported off by the Assyrians, and it's a dagger right to the heart of their motives, saying, do you really believe the God of Israel is the God of all the nations? And do you really believe the prophecies that the nations will be gathered into him? And do you really want that? Do you even want that for your worst enemies? And it's not obvious at all that people do want the best for their enemies. And we think we're used to Jesus' words on the Sermon on the Mount, and we're used to the message of love and forgiveness in the Bible, and we absorb it so quickly and so easily that we forget that it's actually very radical. The most natural thing is to go the grain with your heart and want your enemies to get a doing of whatever, that whether it's a football team or whether it's a nation or whether it's a people group or an ethnicity. The world is full of that. What it doesn't have enough of is people who genuinely want God to show mercy to those that have hurt them and have openly despised them. So he calls God's character into question because he is struggling with just how merciful God is. And I don't know the degree to which we struggle with that. I wonder if we spend time meditating on it, would we? If we went through the list of everyone in our heads, do I want them to get mercy? Do I want them to get mercy? Definitely them, maybe not them. Because we all have lists. And here's the thing that we're meant to see in Jonah. Jonah mirrors things back to us when we're looking at the mercy of God. And we go, I wonder how deep in my heart prejudice runs. I wonder if there are groups of people that find themselves that I struggle to love because of something that I don't even think about consciously, just something in there. I think the challenge to us as a church when we read something like the Jonah's anger at God's mercy is, do we want what we pray for? Many, many churches pray for revival, for the doors to burst open and the great masses of unchurched people to start coming and worshipping and bursting through. And I don't know whether you pray for that or not, but would you want it? It's a real challenge because our church is in decline and we're always talking about that and what the challenge is and how we engage with new people and all of that. And I love that. I'm all for engaging with new people. But it does require us to do work. If we're blessed to encounter new people, then they're often different to us. A lot of Erskine is different to us. They might have different values. They might want to rearrange the furniture a bit. Do you know what I mean? So the challenge is, do you want what you pray for? Do you really want everyone? And I hope that your answer is yes. I hope that you feel that challenge and you go, well, I don't want to, Jonah looks pretty miserable in this last chapter. I don't want to be that. So I'm going to allow God to soften my heart so that I really want his mercy to touch all different kinds of people all around me. Even if that is a bit inconvenient, or even if I'm looking on going, my word, I would never have thought God's mercy could possibly touch their lives. Because I identify with that, because I very much feel like someone who people definitely said, I don't think God will have very much to do with him ever. So anyway, joke's on them, here I am. But he's a merciful God, and nobody is beyond that reach. And then he's a sheltering God. So Jonah is in a huff, and he decides to go then east of the city, so he's running away again to see if God will bring destruction on them. He sits down, he makes a shelter, he sits in its shade to see what would happen, and then God provided a leafy plant and made it grow over Jonah to give shade. Now I want to focus on that word. I said God was a merciful and a sheltering God. That word shade, as the writer's penning it, is a loaded term. It's the Hebrew word that is used for a tent or booth or shelter of any kind. And those of you who've been here a while, I think it was 1 January that we did the Old Testament festivals. There's the festival of, one of them is called the Festival of Booths or Tents or Tabernacles. We don't have one word in English for it. But it's more than just a tent, and it's more than just a bit of shade, and it's more than just a bit of shelter. The word conveys the idea that God himself is providing the shelter. It is reminding the people who read this that God is the Lord over all creation, and if you find yourself in the shade of a leafy plant, it's because he has created a good world that provides shelter to those who need it. They would have read that and gone, we were a people who were brought out of slavery and oppression, and God provided enough of what we need in the wilderness to shelter us from the elements so that we wouldn't die in the wilderness. He is the God who provides not just for their physical needs, but he is the God of their whole lives, and he shelters them from the curses that are written in the Old Testament. He shelters them from their enemies. He shelters them from those who would falsely accuse them. He guards them on every side with his shelter. And that is the hope and the belief of God's covenant people, of those who he's in relationship with. And so God provides that to Jonah, to show him, Jonah, it's very well for you to try your best to fashion something, but I can do even better, and I'm going to give you even more shade, and I'm going to give you the perfect shade and shelter that only I'm able to remind you that as much as you're annoyed that they're getting my mercy, you're only here as well as a recipient of my mercy. God calls his rain to fall on the just and the unjust alike. And he's doing this mercifully. You see, Jonah's questioned God. He's questioned God's integrity. He's been annoyed at the nature of God's integrity. And what does God do? Because I think often we can think, well, it's completely wrong to question God. He is the sovereign Lord over all. And rather than get a ticking off, God engages with him and speaks to him and provides shelter and gives a parable, if you like, a lesson. And it's an interesting parable because when he engages him in conversation, what he does next is he sends a worm to wither the plant and sends a wind, which makes him uncomfortable again, to show him what? I'm the Lord. I give and I take away. I'm the Lord over all creation. Jonah, there's nothing that you're able to manipulate about your environment that is beyond my control. So, try and remember your station in life rather than be mad at me. And the way he says it is what we call a how much more saying. When he's engaging him, you've been concerned about this plant. You intended or make it grow, because he can't, because he's not the creator. And should I not have concern for the great city of Nineveh, in which there are more than 120,000 people, and so on. Does that language remind you of anything? Remember when Jesus is telling his followers not to worry about the things and the cares of this life, and he says, consider the lily, they neither toil nor spin, but Solomon in all his glory was not arrayed like one of those. How much more precious to you, to the Heavenly Father, are you than the lily or the birds of the air? This is a well-worn tradition that Jesus was speaking in, and the Old Testament prophets used it too to get something across. And God is confronting and engaging with Jonah's absurdity by saying, you got really worked up over this plant that was there and then was not there. And you have just spent all your energies being annoyed about that. If you're able to care that much about really what's insignificant, do I not have the right to care about 120-odd thousand people who are absolutely wayward and don't know the way to do justice and to walk in my paths, and they've barely even heard my name? Can you not see the contrast? Ultimately, what he's saying is, I am the Lord over all creation. I can give shelter to whoever I want. And the story of the Bible, really, as it progresses, is God continuing to, through the gospel and through Jesus, expand this shelter that God gives beyond just the family of Abraham and his immediate descendants, to include more and more and more people under its shade. The psalmist describes God as his safety, his shelter, and his shade, because when you taste and you experience that, you know it is the most blessed and the safest place to be. And God is challenging Jonah, saying, Jonah, let me give that shelter to other people. That's what I want to do. Are you not on board with that? He's a merciful God, and he's a sheltering God. And ultimately, this book ends with the confusing note that he is a mysterious God. Because why is Jonah angry about this? If we wanted to give him the benefit of the doubt, we would say he has a heart for justice. I don't think that's what's going on with Jonah, but you could read it that way. That he's concerned because the Ninevites have pillaged and committed atrocities all across the known region. And he's basically going to God and saying, you're letting them off scot-free. God said to Jonah, because he's angry, God says to Jonah, is it right for you to be angry about this? And he says, it is. And I'm so angry, I wish I were dead. I love that interaction because it reminded me of when I'm in a hostile exchange with some of my children, and I'll maybe try and get them to self-reflect and say, do you really think that's an appropriate attitude? Look up and go, yes, with all the strength they can muster. And I'm sure many of you have been there as well, because when someone's in that place, children show us that, we do this sometimes, it's human nature to double down and to think I know what justice is in this instance, and I am determined to see it through and to get it. And even if I start to look more and more unreasonable and absurd, I'd rather stick to my guns. And that's what he's doing, because he thinks possibly justice is not going to get done. Because all those people who maybe they have killed a lot of folks, and they're the ones who have asked God for mercy, and God is going to grant them mercy. And this, I think, is a tension that, and I really only saw this week in this level of detail, is that is not totally resolved across the whole Bible. Because if I were to even ask us in this room and do a straw poll, do you think justice or mercy is more important? Most of us would probably say mercy because we're trying to give the right answer because God is a merciful God. And as a culture, we're a bit more comfortable with God's mercy than his justice. But then if someone went into your car and they did in the side of it and they cleared off before you could get any insurance details and you're left with a bill of 10 grand or something to sort it, you would want justice. So we do have a place and a framework for justice within ourselves, and we want it, but we don't always know how to balance that with mercy. It's really hard to balance that with mercy if we're the one who's been wronged and where great injustice has been done. Sometimes as well, wanting to err on the side of mercy rather than justice speaks of a very privileged life and existence. It means that probably we have not been massively oppressed most of our lives. But that's not true for lots and lots of people groups in the world today. And as we were thinking about with Christian Aid last week and this week, there are lots of people who from birth, their existence is either living under a foreign or an occupying power, having someone else controlling the resources, having people stealing their resources, and all kinds of places in the world. And they probably find the stuff about calling out to God for justice over one's enemies a bit more salient and relevant and applicable than we do. So I don't mean to make you feel bad, but I do encourage you to reflect on the fact that if you are towards the side of mercy, to thank God that you've lived in such a privileged existence that you haven't needed to cry out for justice an awful lot. But also to energize us to remember that there's huge parts of the world that we could maybe use our privilege to help with those who need justice, to advocate for those who need justice and who are constantly overlooked for it. And in terms of the big question, justice and mercy, I don't think we don't get the answer here. And it's like all these really big questions, the ones, why, if God is there and he's good, why does he allow suffering in our world? Or why did he allow the suffering that happened to me? And I never, ever, ever try and answer those questions, because I was in my first year of doing divinity, because you do a bit of systematic theology and you think, brilliant, I've got all the answers to theology in the Bible now. And then the more you learn, the more you know that you don't know. and you stop trying to answer it and you become comfortable. And I think I can encourage us all to become comfortable saying, in some of these things, I just don't know. God seems to reserve the right to not tidy up all the loose ends in the story, not to give us his God-like perspective on everything. But maybe by actually pondering it and reflecting on it and thinking how important it is to live in a world where we look for justice and how much we should look to extend mercy because that is what God is like, maybe by sitting in that tension and wrestling with it, maybe we can get better at making that call. And so maybe the more you do that, it'll be a bit like the wisdom books in the Old Testament, Proverbs and Ecclesiastes. They're hard work, they're hard going. You need to chew them over. But it's like doing any exercise or a workout. The more you do it, the better you get at it and the fitter that you are. And I think that that's what we're meant to do at the end of Jonah, is to keep considering these things. Keep thinking in your life, should I cry out for justice or should I extend some mercy here? Would the most merciful thing for me to be in this situation is to actually demand some justice? And the answer shall actually be different from time to time, because even God changes that script from time to time depending on where we are. But he doesn't give us the secret code to how to figure it out. But that's actually what makes, in many ways, life beautiful and exciting, albeit challenging. It's because we're invited into that process of trying to mirror a God who is gracious, compassionate, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love. Trying to get better at reflecting and looking at that, and also trying to hold that with the fact that he is a good and a just God. And ultimately, we do know he will bring the whole universe and all human existence to a just and a perfect conclusion. But in the meantime, we have books like Jonah, which will give us a workout as we wrestle with that, as we see ourselves in it, as we hopefully learn more about our blind spots and continue to walk in the privilege of trying to do God's justice, love his justice, and do his mercy in his world. May God bless his word to us. Amen.